Kevin Ryan is the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and a founding member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. In 2004, he was fired from his position at Underwriters Laboratories for publicly questioning that company's role in the much criticized NIST report into the destruction of the World Trade Center. In his latest investigation, Ryan turns his attention to the Secret Service's actions on 9/11 and what these actions might tell us about government foreknowledge of the attacks. This is the GRTV feature interview with your host James Corbett and our special guest, Kevin Ryan.
Yeah, there are several parts to that article. The first one asks the question whether the Secret Service was aware in some ways of the events of 9/11. And the reason that that question is asked is that the President of the United States was very well protected in many ways, except from the very obvious danger of terrorists from hijacked airliners. So we had snipers on the roof of the building. It was well planned. People were in the hallways. The police and the Secret Service were all over the place. And yet the president was allowed to enter this building when at 9:03 in the morning on September 11th, everyone else in the country was watching the second plane hit the World Trade Center. And frankly, most people in government were aware of multiple hijackings at that time. They were aware that these planes were being crashed into buildings, at least one of them. And so the question becomes, why did the president enter the building? Why was he allowed to enter the building and put all those people at risk as well as himself? And why the Secret Service allow that? And then just minutes after he entered the building and entered the classroom, the report of the second crash into the World Trade Center was made, and he was told, and everyone knew, including everyone in the United States at that time, including myself, we knew that the country was under a series of coordinated terrorist attacks, and yet the president stayed in that classroom for quite some time, and he actually stayed in the building itself for another 30 minutes or more, even giving a national presentation on television, essentially announcing to the world that he's still there in that building, which part of the difficulty there is that this photo opportunity of the president in this classroom, which was to support his education policy, was announced 4 days before that. And the visitors to this event were brought in 2 days before, given thorough instruction. Everyone knew that he was there in Sarasota at this Booker Elementary. And yet he stayed there for 30 minutes after the second crash into the World Trade Center. So this indicates foreknowledge on the part of the Secret Service, at least, if not others, that this building and the president was not a target on 9/11. Some of the other points made in the article have to do with the protection of the vice president and how quickly he was removed from his location, which was his office in the White House. And there's some contradictory accounts. Most of them put Vice President Cheney being removed by the Secret Service just after 9 o'clock at the time that everybody was learning that the second plane had impacted the World Trade Center. And also at the time that the FAA, and we believe also the Secret Service, was aware that 2 other planes were hijacked and were both headed toward Washington. This article goes into evaluation of some FOIA release documents that were received by 9/11 researcher Aidan Monahan. I've done quite a bit of FOIA requests myself, but Aidan has done some spectacular work and really been persistent in the terms of following up. For example, on this request, he did ask for these documents, Secret Service knowledge, timelines, and was essentially refused. He was told, well, we can't find those documents. And then he asked again, and then they could find the documents. And they did release a number of kind of random documents. Unfortunately, not everything that really is important. I went into, in this article, interviews by 2 really critical people, one of them being Edward Maranzel, who was responsible for the president's activities in Sarasota, and also his boss, Carl Truscott, who was the special agent in charge of the Presidential Protective Division. And Carl Truscott was in the White House. He was taking precautionary measures at 9:15, and yet the 9/11 Commission report says that Vice President Cheney was not removed from his office until 9:36, quite a bit later than that, and well over 30 minutes later than most of the witnesses say. We have a White House photographer, we have the president's secretary, we have Richard Clark, all of these people saying that Vice President Cheney was removed from his office just after 9 o'clock. Why this is important? It's important to realize that there's one very critical testimony that puts Vice President Cheney in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC, at about 9:20 in the morning. And the reason that's important is that there is this testimony from Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta tells the story of how a young man would come in and give the vice president updates about one of the planes coming into Washington. And Mineta actually specifies that this is the plane, Flight 77, headed for the Pentagon. And he gives him reports at 50 miles out and at 30 miles out and at 10 miles out. Now, if Vice President Cheney didn't arrive in the PEOC until 9:38 or after, then he would not have been able to get those reports, according to Mineta. But all these other accounts say that he was whisked out of his office. He would have been there. And the Secret Service documents that have been released also indicate that Vice President Cheney would have been there in the PEOC prior to 9:30 a.m. That's validating the important testimony of Norman Mineta.
And I think in addition to the timeline of the Secret Service response to Cheney, of course, it's also important to take into account the nature of the actions they took in protecting him. And by his own admission, within minutes, well, again, the timeline we can't be sure of, but certainly quite within short order, Secret Service agents were literally hoisting him by his belt, his feet almost not touching the ground as they escorted him to the PEOC. So absolutely, the discrepancy between what happened with Cheney and what happened with Bush, I think, is telling in and of itself.
Absolutely, and there's other little things having to do with, for example, Mrs. Cheney, who, according to the Secret Service documents, was in the White House shelter area, kind of an interim area, almost a hallway, I think, on the way to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, when Carl Truscott, the Secret Service agent in charge, came to get him, Mr. Cheney. Mrs. Cheney was there before 9:30 in the morning. Yet the official count says that Mrs. Cheney didn't even arrive at the White House till almost 10 o'clock in the morning. So there seems to be some very serious discrepancies in these various timelines. This article in the Secret Service also goes into an important question about why the military did not respond to an original request. That is, why the Secret Service, did not respond to an original request from Andrews Air Force Base to provide help. So, for example, Major Daniel Kane was a supervisor of flying at Andrews Air Force Base, and shortly after 9 o'clock again, he called his Secret Service contact. His name was Kenneth Beauchamp, and he said, we're available to help. You guys need any help? We've got jets available, essentially. And Beauchamp told him, no, we don't need any help. This is just after 9 o'clock. A second plane had already crashed in the World Trade Center, and apparently the Secret Service was aware of these other two planes coming in, but Kenneth Beauchamp at least was telling Major Kane that Secret Service did not need help from Andrews Air Force Base. But Beauchamp did say he'd call back. So hang on, I'll call back. 30 minutes later, he never called back. In fact, he never called back at all. But 30 minutes later, someone else from the Secret Service called. This was right before Flight 77 was reported to impact the Pentagon. And that's when they were finally saying, get us some jets, some interceptor jets from Andrews. Well, that's curious in itself. That's 30 minutes difference almost between when the original offer was made by Major Kane and when he was taken up by the Secret Service. The more glaring discrepancy is that jets didn't actually launch from Andrews for more than an hour after that. So 90 minutes after Major Kane originally offered help. And the reason for that is there's a lot of discussion about this General Worley who showed up. He was the supervisor, wasn't there originally. He was actually the commander of Andrews Air Force Base, and he showed up right around the time Flight 77 was impacting the Pentagon, and the official story says he was very confused about who had the authority to order jets to launch, and he wouldn't take the information from the Secret Service. It's all very confusing. General Worley's no longer with us. He died in a very unusual train accident in Washington. But it is really important for us to see that Andrews Air Force Base was only 10 miles away from the Pentagon. And it didn't launch jets until 10:38 in the morning, over an hour after the Pentagon was hit. And these weren't even armed jets. So if you're going to launch non-armed jets, at least you could do it around the time these buildings are being hit. But there is no explanation for why that was not done.
Well, let's drill down into this a little further. So obviously the actions or inactions of the Secret Service detail of Bush on that day are extremely puzzling at the very least, and due to the call for transparency on those actions, I think is a well-placed one. But in terms of protocol or procedures that should be followed in these situations, do we have any idea of what is actually written down, or if there's anything that we know that the Secret Service should have been doing in this situation?
Well, the only thing I referred to was a book that was written by an expert on the Secret Service who was also just really confused by why, for example, in the elementary school, the Secret Service didn't immediately move the president to a secure location. That's really the Presidential Protective Division, the PPD of the Secret Service. That's their entire job. And my understanding from I can't name the exact references right now, but my understanding is that they don't really even require the authority to be given to them. It's their authority. If the president or the vice president or other people they're in charge of are in danger, they are to immediately move those people to a secure location. It would be nice to be able to reference, and I think that's a good follow-up action, the actual law that says this, or the actual procedure in Secret Service documentation. I'll try to find that, but my understanding is that from experts who have studied it, this is just immediate. It's not even something that they would ask the president about. It's their job to do that, to protect the president.